Hello, this is World Review. I'm Deborah Amos, and I'm sitting in this week for Ivo Dadler. He'll be back next week. This is your weekly look at news around the world from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, April 28th. This week, here's what we're looking at. In Sudan, it's an ongoing conflict, and why is Russia's Wagner Group in Sudan? Then we're going to look at the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, lashed out at Western officials at the UN this week. And finally, the future of AI. We're all supposed to be scared, even though we think that ChatGPT might be useful to us. And so we have an expert here who can guide us through whether we should be afraid or we should be applauding. Here is who is going to explain the world for us this week. Ryan Heath, he's the global technology correspondent with Axios. Yvonne Murray, global security reporter, RTE News, and Giles Whittell, world affairs editor, Tortoise Media. So, Giles, I want to start with you. I want to talk about Sudan. Can you set the scene for us? What we have is a pro-democracy movement that's been derailed by two competing military men. The country's been ripped apart by violence. And we also found out this week, and probably we already knew it, is that Russia's Wagner Group is in Sudan. And so there must be some way that the Wagner Group, also famous in Ukraine reporting, has to do with the violence. Can you just set the scene for us and who's who and why they are fighting so viciously in Sudan?
I will do my best. We're about 12 days into the fighting. Reporting in many Western countries has been dominated, objectionably to my mind, in many cases by the dramatic but largely marginal evacuation of expats from Khartoum to points north and west. The real crisis involves the 45 million population of this vast strategic country, which, as you say, enjoyed for about 4 years a democratic interlude, or at least a peaceful interlude that was supposed to lead to full democracy. Instead, we have what everyone's been calling an incipient civil war. To my mind, when you have each side bombing the other with jets as well as artillery, it's a civil war. You've already got perhaps north of 250,000 civilian refugees fleeing to the north and to the south, to South Sudan, and interethnic violence, which tortured Darfur in the west a few years ago, has kicked off again. The two faction leaders, General al-Burhan, the de facto president, and the Mohammed Hemeti, as his nom de guerre goes, in charge of the RSF, the paramilitary organization derived from the Janjaweed, of which he was a commander, the Janjaweed being the militia chiefly responsible for the genocide in Darfur.
They were called Hell on Horseback, I believe.
Yeah. Now, it would be convenient if there was an external all-purpose villain to account for the viciousness of what's happening and the timing. And sure enough, it is true that the Wagner Group, Russia's most bloodthirsty, most ubiquitous mercenaries, have a presence in Sudan. But that's too simple. It is one thing to acknowledge that, and another to have a causal relationship between their presence and the violence. What we know is that the Wagner Group is involved in gold mining in the north of Khartoum, and in Darfur. We know that the Russian state is intimately connected with the Russian side, the President al-Burhan's troops as well, and that the Russian state is deeply interested in obtaining access rights to Port Sudan, a warm Sudanese port opposite Saudi Arabia on the Gulf Coast. But that is not the same as saying that Wagner mercenaries are responsible for the violence itself. And while there have been reports of Wagner involvement in the fighting, there's nothing that anyone can really point to concretely on that front. The broader pattern seems to be that this gold needs to find its way to world markets and does so via Port Sudan to the UAE. And in turn, there is a transaction that turns gold into cash in the UAE, into weapons. Libya is involved, and the weapons come back to Wagner and possibly the RSF in Sudan. The tragedy is that a country that was clinging to a measure of stability for a few years now seems to be heading for or in civil war, like most of its neighbors. That's the sitrep. And it's
so
very...
I'm also, Yvonne and Ryan, jump in when you want to, but I also want to ask, I mean, it sounds to me that this is a business deal with guns, which makes it all the harder to resolve. This is not about sitting down and having a peace talk. It's about sitting down and carving up pies. And so I wondered if, from your perspective, that this is one of those that goes on for a while. They have just sort of dropped into this terrible space. They were doing okay. And maybe this is a two-part question. One, is that correct? And two, how did these guys get in a position where they were the ones that got to determine whether Sudan becomes a democratic state or, one that looks more like Syria?
The first part of your question, how long does this go on, relates to the origins. You had two army-sized military forces in one country, two warlords who were initially allied and are now rivals for power. There is no obvious way out of this. The neighbors and foreign peace brokers, you can be sure that China will seek a role in this in due course, may play a role. But if neighboring conflicts are any guide, think Ethiopia, Eritrea, Burkina Faso, Mali. This will go on as long as and until the resources of the warring parties are exhausted. And in the meantime, the concern is that far from being contained, it'll spill over, especially into Chad, which was the other part of this part of Africa, which was relatively stable up until now. How did these two characters get into this situation? I'm going to defer to others on the panel on the history of the transition from al-Bashir to the current position. I don't know enough about their biographies, but there's very little ground for optimism that this will be resolved anytime soon.
I will ask the others on the panel, because I had read that it was possible to stop these guys earlier, and nobody did. None of the powers that have a stake in this conflict made it not worth their while to do what they're doing. And so, they could. So they did. And, this is about more than power. It's about money. It's about control. It's about a lot of those things. Any of you have comments on how we got here?
Yeah, well, I was interested to hear the comments by a former member of the civilian government of Sudan, whose view is slightly different in that not that the external powers or the world superpowers were not doing enough in Sudan, but actually that they were pushing it too far, that the timeline was too squeezed in order to move from the military regime back to civilian rule and some kind of democratic infrastructure being set up. His view was very much that needed time, and it needed really, really careful management. And to try and push these, warring factions together to accommodate each other into an army that would then, work together was just too sensitive, and it was going to spill over because of these huge personalities and egos that simply couldn't get on. And I think in terms of looking at the external powers as well, one other criticism was that the views of other African nations, which of course have to be taken into account, but they superseded the views of the local Sudanese would-be, democratic powers. And I think that's a very interesting perspective to look at, because I think often it seems that the external powers are not doing enough. And this politician's view was actually they were doing too much at that point and they should have held back a little bit.
Very interesting. I want to move with you, Yvonne, to another Russia-related topic, and that is the appearance of Sergei Lavrov in New York at the UN this week. You know, they are making the most, Russia, of this 1-month role as the president of the Security Council. It's a rotating role, and it was a star turn for Lavrov. He was combative. He was doing Russian propaganda. He was getting pushback from Western powers. But at the end of the day, was it worth it for him to do what he did, despite, getting a pretty vigorous pushback? But they got their point out. Do you think it was worth it for them?
It's very, very interesting, Deborah. And I think that, just watching Lavrov in action this week at the United Nations, it's very clear he is very comfortable in this environment. He's a former Russian ambassador to the United Nations. He was there for 10 years. He knows it inside out. He understands the protocol. He was very well respected at the UN in his day. He's got plenty of friends there. And he exudes that confidence as he, swans around the corridors, refusing to take questions from the press. And I think it really set the cat amongst the pigeons at the very beginning of April when the Russian delegation announced that Lavrov was coming towards the end of the presidency. It opened this dilemma for the rest of the Security Council members. Do they dignify his presence and his narrative by turning up or by even sending ministers, or do they boycott? And they had not decided until the 11th hour. And I know this because I was trying to write a story on it, and I was calling the missions and saying, who are you going to send on Monday when Lavrov turns up? And they really didn't know until the last minute. I think it was the Friday before. The US, France, and UK announced, we still weren't sure about China, they announced that they were going to send their permanent representative. So kind of business as usual in that regard. And I think what it came down to in the end, the strategy was, look, if we don't send anybody, or if we send our junior diplomats, that's really going to hand the narrative to Lavrov. And he's going to be able to say, look, the Western powers, as he likes to say, don't even care enough about these pressing international issues like violations of the UN Charter to turn up to this meeting, this hugely important meeting, or the second meeting on the Middle East. So they felt in the end that they needed to be there and they needed to try and counteract the narrative. And as you say, it was a star turn. The ability of Lavrov and the Russian mission to turn the tables and to turn everything on its head, and the very audacity of holding a meeting on the UN, the defense of the principles of the UN Charter at the very moment that they are launching a war against its neighbor. I think that really speaks to Lavrov's confidence. Did it work? Yes, I think that the so-called Western powers certainly hit back. And I think that they were very strong, debunking some of the messages that he put across. At the same time, he ran through the history of America's violations of the UN Charter in technicolor, starting with going as far back as the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, right through to Yugoslavia, onto Libya, Iraq. I mean, he literally left nothing out. And while the other members of the Security Council can hit back against that, that narrative does go over in other parts of the United Nations, especially in the global South, especially in countries that have, suffered through those conflicts. And they see that, perhaps I don't completely agree with the invasion of Ukraine, but Lavrov does have something of a point. I think that is really the danger for the other members of the Security Council when it comes to this kind of high-level visit.
But let's talk about the audacity meter. The day after Putin was indicted by the International Criminal Court for kidnapping, giving the nod to kidnapping Ukrainian children, he went on television with his co-defendant, who has also been indicted. She is the head of the Commission for Children's Rights, and he went on television after the indictment, and then she spoke to the UN this month, and I wondered. Yeah. She did, and there was a great deal of pushback, but I mean those two events are narrative building. Did you feel that at the UN?
Yes, and I think I think the US, certainly the UK, had some success with that particular meeting because that was an informal ARIA meeting, and they succeeded in getting the webcast blocked. That seems like a small thing, but actually it's quite effective in terms of trying to curtail the sort of broadcasting of these narratives. Again, the fact that she, speaking directly from the Kremlin, is able to have an audience within the United Nations just shows you how powerful Russia still is within the UN system. I interviewed the ambassador from Ukraine very early in Russia's presidency, and they were really going out of their way to try and protest, to try and prevent the presidency going ahead. But really, there was nothing that Ukraine could do. And I think that kind of, the fact that Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, can really do what it likes was a real reminder of how the UN system works, and really this multipolar world that Lavrov has been banging on about this week is really here already.
Yeah.
So let me ask all of you to come in on this one, and that is, the Russians are on this charm campaign in Latin America, and it's all about this multilateralism. But I wondered if any of you had a notion. There's talk about having a vote in the UN General Assembly for an international war crimes tribunal for Ukraine, and there's part of this that feels like it's lobbying. They just want to make sure that there can never be a positive vote, that they are making their case, they're making it strongly, they're using every tool they have. They use their month wisely. Do you all see this as a campaign? And a lot of it has to do with Ukraine.
Yes. You can blame Lavrov and Russia for a lot of things, but the UN is about showing up, and you can't blame him for showing up. And I don't want to say a word like respect, but using the system. And I think sort of one of the underlying points that Yvonne was explaining is that a lot of the Western powers have not really treated the UN with respect or used it as a vehicle in the way that other countries, including Russia, have done for a long time. And there's two really key countries I want to sort of highlight for the audience here, and that's India and South Africa. And, I think with these previous votes that have been occurring over the past 12, 15 months on Ukraine, the Western democratic allies have kind of hit their ceiling of where they're going to go unless they change strategy generally, whether you're talking about in the UN or in the fighting of the war. And South Africa and India are locking in, and they're big players in the UN, and they take it really seriously. And Russia is succeeding there. And it's like we in the West keep trying to do the same thing again and again and expect a different result. And I think in a way, the only way is down if we keep having UN votes. Like maybe you can maintain this level where 140 out of 200 are supporting. There's a majority, but not a consensus on the Security Council. But the only way is down unless we can do more to show that we're not just keeping grain away from the poor countries of the world, that this isn't just some warped form of, not colonialism, but the arguments that Russia is mounting because of all the pain that the West has inflicted in places like Africa and Latin America in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yvonne, do you think that is what this is about, going to Latin America? This is a lobbying campaign?
I think to a large extent, but I think that, as Ryan just mentioned, the grain deal is a huge thing, and I think again, let's not lose sight of that in our comfortable perches in Europe and the United States. This matters hugely to the rest of the world, and it is being held hostage by the Russian mission at the UN. If you don't meet us on our demands for Russian exports, we're going to pull back from the grain deal. and we're going to blame you. And I think that's very effective. And I think for a lot of countries in Latin America and Africa as well, there's a huge war fatigue setting in. I think that the high food prices are wearing people down. They do not want to see an end to the grain deal, and they think that in order to keep Russia on board, then other powers need to compromise more. Russia knows all of that. So it just uses it so effectively. And I think it has remarkable leverage, actually more than perhaps people in Europe and the US give it credit for.
And that's the China thing.
Go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I really will keep it brief. I don't think China will necessarily succeed with its attempt to mediate or send an envoy, but what you've just described, Yvonne, is exactly the crack in the door that China is trying to walk through.
Yeah. And all I was going to say is I usually say that Syria was the off-Broadway for Ukraine. Every year there's a vote on cross-border aid. And every year it's a hostage-taking situation. And the Russians know very well how to play it. And so this looks awfully familiar to me with the way that they're dealing with the grain deal. And let me ask you, Giles, do you also see this multilateralism? What do you think this means to the Russians? What is it that they're selling?
A world in which they don't have to be lectured to all the time by the US. Just a point on Lavrov, who is a fascinating character and speaks fluent English and has been in post for so many years that I overlapped with him in Moscow more years ago than I can admit. It's easy to think that because he's such a citizen of the world and speaks English, that he doesn't really believe in the most toxic things that he says on behalf of the Kremlin, on behalf of Putin. But I had an interesting conversation just recently with Cathy Ashton, the former EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, who did a lot of sitting in meeting rooms with him and with Putin and others at the time of the initial invasion of Crimea, and described in a book that I commend to you that she's just written, a meeting that she convened between the Ukrainians and Lavrov at that time in 2014, in which they were unable to make eye contact. And Lavrov wasn't being shy. He wasn't being coy. He just hated them. And I think I certainly underestimated the extent to which he, even if he didn't believe it at the beginning, has internalized Putin's pretty deranged rhetoric and nationalistic take on the history of Russia and Ukraine. And so the reason he's putting on such a good show is because it's a show of conviction. I just want to say a couple other things. While we're talking commodities, let's forget Brazil and fertilizer. Brazil's soy crop is almost entirely dependent on Russian fertilizer. So there's a very concrete pillar for multipolarity or at least bilateral cooperation between Russia and Brazil. And one other point, if I may, from the on the global south perspective, which Ryan and Yvonne have both mentioned, you don't have to disagree with the Western view of who started this war to resent the assumption that you'll buy in and vote with the EU and with the US and
that you back a trial.
Sorry?
That you back a trial. That's a big ask.
Yes, exactly. And Guterres was making this point informally at Davos that the West maybe, and in my view, is morally in the right position, is doing the right thing to try to arm Ukraine and get the map back to 1991. But that doesn't mean that they understand what's going on in the global south and the UN.
So, and let's talk then about Brazil, because one of the people that, of course, Lavrov is talking to is, the head of Brazil, because it's a big country. It can be in this category of, the people who support multilateralism. He is thinking about taking a role in a peace process with Ukraine. He would get something for kind of signing with the Russians. They're not asking him to sign all the way, but enough that, he gets to walk on the international stage. They do have things to give away, correct, in Latin America to bring people to their side.
Yeah, I mean, Lula was welcomed with open arms by the democratic West as a breath of fresh air after Bolsonaro, and he promptly says that Ukraine is as culpable as Russia for this war, which is like darkness at noon. It's night and day. But as you say, he's been invited into a peace club by Xi Jinping. Would relish a role in peace broken Ukraine. One thing you have to say, though, is that any peace proposal based on that kind of premise would not be acceptable for. It would be impossible for any Ukrainian leader to sign. So while it may feel good for founding members of the Peace Club, I don't think it'll go anywhere.
Yeah.
Yvonne?
I think that's exactly right. I think it is considered certainly by the Ukrainians to be a non-starter. For a start, it doesn't mention anything about the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. So where do you even start with that? I just wanted to briefly go back to a point that Giles made at the very beginning about the coverage of the Sudanese conflict and the evacuation, this focus on the evacuation of Europeans, Americans, etc. And it just struck me looking at the news this morning, the evacuation of Chinese citizens. And I don't know if any of you saw this, but the ship had a red banner on the side which said, Chairman Xi has sent a ship to take you all home, not missing the opportunity for, a touch of red banner propaganda there in amongst it all. So not just the Europeans and the Americans who are making a propaganda victory out of this dreadful situation.
And I saw in the paper a British doctor who was in Britain on a work visa of some kind. Maybe he was Pakistani, I don't know, but he was a person of color. And he couldn't get evacuated on the British flight because of his work visa. And so you have these two competing narratives. We've come to get you, and it's racist. It's always racist. That is not a good look.
And that does not go unnoticed either. It
Correct.
Really doesn't. And I think the other thing that people in Sudan have found objectionable is this idea that this conflict somehow came out of the blue. And I've heard it repeated actually quite a few times over the past couple of weeks. Oh, we weren't expecting that. Well, that's because you weren't paying attention. And I think that's very insulting to people in Sudan who've lived with this conflict or being on the brink of civil war for many years, not to mention the dreadful atrocities carried out in Darfur before that. So this is something that, again, going back to the Ukraine conflict, the kind of the upset that is felt in some parts of the world that there is a huge amount of focus on the Ukraine, rightly, on the Ukraine conflict. But sometimes to the cost of other events, other conflicts, other wars going on around the world. And I think that's certainly true of the refugee crisis. Ireland, my country, has taken in 80,000 Ukrainian refugees. That's a huge amount for a country of 5 million people. But has the European Union, has Ireland been as welcoming to other refugees from the Horn of Africa, for example, from other conflict zones? It's a moral question. And I think it's one that's being asked in many parts of the world.
Yeah. Ryan, do you have anything to add, or should we move on to AI, which we promised?
Let's do AI, but I will note Dilma Rousseff, the former Brazilian president, has been rehabilitated as the head of the Bank of the BRICS countries. So there is a broader Brazil engagement play going on from the two biggies in that group. So they're not stupid. They're thinking around the corner.
We'll have you all back and we'll do that. The role of Brazil at some moment. But I do want to talk about the future of AI because there has been a tsunami of coverage. It's not that it wasn't heavy before, but all of a sudden, somehow everybody's figured this out that, and I think because there's been a couple of innovations from the first time it rolled out, but it's going so fast. And I wonder if you can talk about this a little bit. Should we be alarmed? Do we need to know what the perils are? I mean, there was an open letter that called for a pause in all AI experiments. So where are we? And should I be afraid?
There are many reasons to be afraid and some things to not be afraid of amongst that broader sort of suggestion to be afraid that I'm about to offer. So I think first and foremost, with some of the tools you may have interacted with or read about, the ChatGPT being the most famous one, that is in no way a human-like at all. It does not have sentient capabilities. It's not going to get them. It's probably not even going to be able to clean itself up because of the way it's structured. They might actually have to go back to scratch and rebuild it with different data sets that aren't as polluted as the open internet. But it does inspire this sort of awe because it feels human in the way you interact with it from time to time. So I think don't be too worried about where that particular technology is going to go. And then for that reason as well, do not worry that you're going to be enslaved by robots in the coming years. I don't think that is the main thing to be worrying about. We are a long way from a godlike artificial general intelligence, it's called. But that's a lot of things to be confused and fearful about, and some people are. And I think that there is a really dangerous middle that we do need to be worried about, which is that as humans, we're very capable of hurting ourselves, and we're very capable of degrading and possibly destroying our democracies for those of us that live in democracies in the meantime. And we're much more likely to do that before we ever get enslaved by robots or other machines. And there are a few steps along that way that I wanted to outline, and I'll try and be brief about it. I think the first is that we are entering this new sort of generative AI era for the first time where the technology companies are the biggest companies in the world. All these other iterations like the internet, microchips, personal computing, tech companies weren't the biggest companies in the world. You didn't have these trillion-dollar giants in control of much. Now they are. And they have the possibility to become gatekeepers, not just to information, but to all sorts of levers of power in society. And if
Can you explain what generative means? I'm not sure I know as I hear you talk about it.
So generative is when the AI can produce content itself. It's not just displaying content. You are giving it prompts or asking it questions, and then it will deliver you answers based on all the patterns it finds on the data that's already been fed into it. In the case of ChatGPT, that's everything that's ever been on the internet, all the good and the bad, which is why it makes so many mistakes, because it can't always tell. It can't attribute value. It just treats all of it as data points and then sometimes makes things up by making the wrong connections. And because the makers of ChatGPT don't actually know where those connections occur, because it's all just one big black box, they can't explain to you how the errors occur. And that, I think, is going to lead to some long-term trust problems. And so, for example, if this company that has built this becomes one of the big Googles or Microsofts of the world, they're a gatekeeper to information. And as we get fewer of those gatekeepers, if they're about to decide that they want to get political and have manifestos, then all of a sudden you have got a completely different set of political actors. You also have systems that can deliver much more finely tuned propaganda at scales we've never seen before, which is a great way to trap people into not understanding what is true or false and finding everything too confusing to deal with, which is what the Russian population finds itself in after 20 years of Putin. So instead of Putin taking 20 years to do that in one country, imagine all of that happening in a couple of years across all democracies. Scary situation. With surveillance techniques that are made possible by these AI tools, it's much easier for people who are strongmen or want to be strongmen to sort of know where we all are and what we're all doing. Cyber attacks, and I don't just mean people hacking your computer, but people pretending to be in love with you, people pretending to be offering you a service. You can be scammed at a speed and a scale that you'll no longer be able to keep up with as an individual. So that's very confusing. And then if we were to ever end up in a war, for example, with China, for whatever reason, you have a lot of weapons that might be used in ways that have no guardrails attached to them. The martial law or the emergency decree that comes with that war might suddenly become permanent. And you have all of these situations where democracy can degrade or just slip away quicker than we might ever have imagined. And that's all before we ever get to the robots being in charge of us. It's dictators that might end up being in charge of us.
So, Yvonne and Giles, do you find yet that this is changing your jobs as reporters?
Not yet, but I'm very tempted to use ChatGPT to write my stories sometimes when I've got a deadline looming. I don't think I can come down on one side or the other yet. I think that there's huge potential, isn't there, Ryan, for AI in the kind of work that we do,
Yep.
in terms of like opening up the kind of creative field. At least getting people started in the creative industries, and then being able to, put our own spin on it or whatever. So it's obviously not all negative. At the same time, I'm from a generation which finds this all quite terrifying. So I feel like it's very hard for me to form an opinion. I don't know what Giles thinks.
Giles?
Very nearly changed my job as a parent last night when a student-aged child of mine completely blocked on a fairly complex university essay on late romantic novels came to me for advice. I spoke to an old friend who's an English teacher. He said, ChatGPT 4. I said, you can't be serious. He said, yes, I am. At least you'll get the skeleton and then he can edit it. I said, surely they have software to detect the plagiarism. He said, I don't think they do. I don't think they can tell. It would probably be a bad essay. As Ryan says, there would probably be a lot of errors in it, but it might at least have got him off the starting blocks.
Yeah.
As to the professional side of this, I think it's long been clear that in the more sort of brute force volume dissemination of information part of journalism, to wit, market reports on companies, basic 3-paragraph descriptions of football matches, soccer matches, as you would call them, AI can do that work. I'm perhaps of the same generation as you, Yvonne, and hitherto, instead of being terrified, I've actually just been in denial and pushing it to one side. But a point that Ryan just made, what if, I think you were effectively asking, what if OpenAI gets political? What then? And of course, we have an example of a platform which was strenuously apolitical or even-handed, in my view, until now, getting political in Twitter. My feed is changing. That's all too real. And so now, thank you very much, Ryan. I'm terrified along with Yvonne.
Yeah, I would love to ask a question though, Ryan, about the politicization of AI, but particularly when it comes to being able to distinguish between impartial media reports and propaganda. Because we know that China and Russia are very good. They have very sophisticated news operations these days. And I know that some people have experimented with ChatGPT and it can't tell the difference very well.
Yeah.
So what do we do about that?
Yeah, it's extremely tricky. Like, obviously, you need AI media literacy training wherever possible at all points, and people need a variety of information. So I think at a policy level, what I'm very worried about is a lack of guardrails. So it's maybe a nice idea to say, oh, let's pause all AI research for 6 months. It's not enforceable, so it's a non-starter from that point of view. Second of all, it means only people like Elon Musk would be able to catch up with OpenAI because they can throw billions at it in those 6 months. All the other startups that are trying to do it in a better way but haven't attracted all of this attention and money, they would be killed by a pause, so it won't work. But what we need are some red flags in the system on the way to developing maybe regulatory bodies dedicated just to AI, in the same way that we have people that have controlled the deployment of autonomous vehicles. That's a form of AI. We didn't just let them onto the roads to kill everybody. So there needs to be systems for raising red flags, possibly independently assessing and certifying some of these things before they sort of run us over, because I think the point is you'll never as an individual be able to keep up with all of this. And the kind of light touch but scary, nevertheless, example I'd use is imagine, you know the old Nigerian fake Prince letters, come and send me $1 million and I'm going to come, all that. Well, imagine that being applied to your family members based on everything they've ever said into their phones and the way they've talked to their former partners and the people that they love. And those scams being precisely targeted to exactly what is going to trigger you into giving over that information or doing something stupid, or they tell you that they hate you and you should kill yourself and you believe it, and then you're out there committing suicide. And as individuals, we can't cope with that massive information. So we need systems to help us and to put constraints in place before it becomes the out of control situation. And those out of control situations sound really dramatic and terrible and terrifying, but I think people talk about it in those terms because once you get there, it's very hard, if not impossible, to wind it back. You've got to stop it before you get there.
So I've got one more question because we've only got 5 minutes left, and that's to you, Ryan. I have a student, by the way, who has written a program to detect Chat GPT, and I'm betting on him. I was supposed to write a bunch of letters for him to go to business school, but he wrote me and said, never mind, I'm going to open my company and work on that. And I thought, you go, please do. So it's made me think, look, there was no government guardrails on social media so far. Europe is ahead of the United States on that. Do you think that it's more likely that we will have private interventions like my student who will probably make a great deal of money on if he can pull it off, to have that as a tool, that it will come from private, unlikely from government, because somehow they can't seem to get it together to do that?
Yeah, I think that's probably true because the innovation now is happening so fast. No government could keep. It's not even reasonable to expect a government to keep up. And the EU's law, which they've just finalized yesterday, it didn't predict generative AI. So it doesn't mean it's useless, but it won't help us with the particular problems that have just emerged in the last 3 months. And that's an example of where the lawmakers can't win. It's not because they're incompetent or lazy. It's just the nature of this means they'll never succeed on their own. So we do need private initiative. That is absolutely the case. But also, if you want to maintain rule of law, you have to think of the legal constraints that can give us the opportunity to pause, not in the style of Elon Musk stopping everyone for 6 months, but letting us have a full debate. And another really important point that some experts that I've spoken to really impressed upon me is that because this will and is affecting everybody, it doesn't matter that you don't know the details yet or you don't know enough. You have the right to be involved in the debate because it is going to fundamentally change your life. And yes, get more informed, but don't use whatever ignorance you have as a reason to think you're not entitled to be part of the discussion. Because that's how
people know that everybody's going to be involved in this. I'm not convinced that they do.
That's my job to tell you. All I can do is tell you.
I think the Secretary General of the UN is appointing a new AI czar quite soon. So I think that they see it as something that they're going to open a whole new department to discuss. And Jacinda
Ardern is coming to Harvard to work on AI governance. So, she might be available down the road from New York to be that AI czar.
So this is all part of the private possibilities. I suppose not a surprise. And Giles, you get the last word if you want it.
Well, I just wanted to ask a very quick supply-demand question. If you look at the use of ChatGPT and equivalents, supply is inexhaustible. Demand is inexhaustible. But there are these choke points in certain bits of the microprocessor industry. The fabs, there's only they're concentrated in Taiwan. There's just this one company in the Netherlands that makes the machine that cuts that etches the chips. And then there's limited capacity on design of the hardware. Are any of those choke points in any way limiting the supply of AI, or am I confusing your regular high-end chips with those that you might need in cars?
You're right. I think it might be a problem for what is known as the large language models that ChatGPT uses. And the point there is they draw on the whole internet, and that's why they're so energy intensive. But the way to get more accurate generative AI is probably to use more smaller and more curated data sets of more verifiable, high quality information, not just everything that's randomly out there. And when you have some of these smaller models and then you network them, a bit like the parts of the brain do have different functions, you can isolate like a brain surgeon would where the problem is going wrong, and you wouldn't be using as much energy and you wouldn't need as many chips to power it all. So there are other ways to do it that are not ChatGPT. And one of the risks is everyone is so obsessed about missing the ChatGPT boat that we all sign up to, let's say, a crappier version of AI than we need to because of our fear of missing out. So I think there are other ways to do it. And if we don't choose them, then yes, you're right, Giles, this all might have very more mundane physical world limitations. And we can't time travel into the future to get the solar power to run it all if we run out of the fossil fuels. So there will be limits somehow if we don't improve the model behind all of this.
And again, I'd like to thank all three of you for being here. Now I imagine that what I'm going to get out of this is I make better travel plans because you feed in, all the flights. And it's easier than kayak to use. But look, I'd like to thank all of you because I think that we did tackle this week's the biggest news. So Ryan Heath, global technology correspondent from Axios, Yvonne Murray, global security reporter, RTE News, and Giles Whittell, world affairs editor, Tortoise Media. And thank all of you for listening to World Review.